Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the J. Scott Ascension, which is my podcast where we're going to be discussing everything from politics to current events, health and wellness, and even ancient history. A lot of different topics. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed yet. Today, we have a very, very special guest with us I've been looking forward to speaking with. I had the opportunity to meet him at the Jimmy Dore Show live over here in West Palm Beach at the Improv a few weeks ago. And tonight we have with us Mr. Tim Canova. And just to give a brief background on who he is, Tim is a current professor law professor at Nova University, and he is also a past congressional candidate for Broward, where he ran against Debbie Wasserman Schulz. The reason why I have him on the show today is to talk a little bit about election security, his experience in running in the Democratic Party, and maybe to discuss a few other current events that are happening right now that I'd love to hear his opinion on. So before we jump right into it, Tim, can you just give people a little bit more detail on who you are, and then we'll jump right into it?
Sure. Thank you, Jay. It's thanks for having me on. It's nice to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I grew up in New York in the suburbs. I studied in undergrad at a small college called Franklin and Marshall College, where I studied government and economics and history. After college, I worked on Capitol Hill, landed a job working for the late U.S. Senator Paul Tsongas. He was a Democrat from Massachusetts, as a legislative aide. Went to law school at Georgetown University, practiced law in New York City for several years, and then went into teaching. My first tenured job where I received a tenured appointment was at University of New Mexico School of Law. I lateraled over to a school in Southern California called Chapman University, where I was the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs for a while before coming to Nova Southeastern. Most of my career as a law professor, I was writing critically about the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and central banking, particularly the Federal Reserve. I became active in the movement against the Trans-Pacific Partnership proposal. This was in 2015. I was working with a group called the Citizens Trade Campaign, and we were lobbying our local congresswoman, and I certainly tried to reach her office and speak to any legislative aid, and I found that became impossible, that unless you donated you were a political action committee to give $5,000 to her reelection. You couldn't get the time of day, not even from a legislative aide. And here I was, a tenured law professor at the only law school in her district and in Broward County.
Wow.
Started to attend both protests outside of her offices and public forums that we started to put on, dealing with the TPP and what would have, a lot of people forget the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but it was part of this big globalization agenda. At the end of the day, Wasserman Schulz was the only Democrat in Florida's House delegation to vote to fast track the TPP. And at that point, we started to look for someone who would challenge her in a Democratic primary. And when I say we, I mean the Citizens Trade Campaign and the other activists who were involved. And we approached a number of Florida legislators, state legislators, mayors, county commissioners, and we couldn't find anyone willing to challenge her in a Democratic primary, probably because she was the chair of the Democratic National Committee at the time.
Yep.
I kind of got talked into it, and not right away. I was pretty reluctant at first, but by the end of 2015, when Wasserman Schulz used the DNC to lock the Bernie Sanders campaign out of the van voter database. And the Sanders campaign sued the DNC. And the day they sued the DNC, the groundswell around the nation was so big that the Sanders campaign raised $1 million in small donations. And at that point, I realized that probably the biggest deterrent that I was facing in running against her is that I'm not a wealthy man, and I was not about to go fundraising for corporate money. And suddenly I realized that she was very vulnerable among the grassroots. And still people thought I was, just nuts to challenge her. But I really felt when I went in that it was going to go well. And indeed, I jumped in January of 2016, and within several weeks, it started going viral. We started raising big money, raised about $1 million, I think, in the first 2 or 3 months. And then out of the blue, did not see it coming, Bernie Sanders endorsed me. And the day he endorsed me, we raised $250,000, all in small donations.
Wow.
And in that campaign, which was an August 30th primary, so about an 8-month campaign, we raised $3.8 million without taking a single penny from any corporate interest. We had 209,000 individual donations with an average donation of $17. And at the time, according to Huffington Post, it broke all records for a candidate for national office in the percentage of money coming from small donors, which they defined as under $200. With the money that we raised, we threw it into a local field operation. I think it was the largest grassroots campaign in the country at that time for a congressional district. We opened up 4 field offices in my one district. And to give you an idea how unusual that was, most campaigns really only have 1 field office. And the Bernie Sanders campaign had only 1 field office in all of South Florida. We had four in my one district. And at the peak of the summer, we were knocking on 12,000 doors a week. And making 3,000 phone calls a week. And when our volunteers and field organizers were knocking on doors, they were using what was called the minivan. So on their smartphones, they would rank the engagement. And we went back to the same home, typically 2, 3, 4 times. And you would see the engagement shift from somebody who was undecided to leaning towards Canova to strong towards Canova. And there was very little polling. Early in the summer, there was a mainstream poll that said Wasserman Schulz was ahead by, I think, something like around 12 points or something like that, but with something like 20% undecided. We conducted a poll with a very reputable pollster who I've known for a long time. And it showed us down by 8 points with about 20% undecided. So it was closing quickly. And this was really before we hit our peak in the summer.
And how long was that before the actual election, when you did that last poll?
I think that was about 3 months, almost 2 to 3 months. So when you looked at the field numbers, though, and I should back up and say the polling was really based on calling 600 likely voters. Okay, and you're calling them on landlines. So what does that tell you about the sample size?
There's only a certain amount of people who even have landlines nowadays. Most people operate on a cell phone, so the only people who really have landlines are going to be your older population, who are much less likely, I should say, to take a risk on a risky candidate like yourself. So.
Exactly. And when we looked at our final field numbers, we had, I think we identified, I think it was only 5,000 or so voters who were either leaning to Wasserman Schulz or strongly for Wasserman Schulz. And there were probably the 5,000 either elderly folks who voted for her all the time or people on the party's central committee in Broward County. And we had, I mean, it was shocking. We had about, I think, 14,000 who were strong for me and 8,000 who were leaning to me. And about 13,000 undecided, which meant she could have gotten every undecided, and we would win that election. Now, some would say, well, there's going to be a natural bias when people are answering the door and they see somebody with a Tim Canova shirt, they're not going to want to disappoint them. And that might be, but it certainly suggested, not just those numbers, but our experience at the early voting sites, 10 days of early voting, where it seemed like everybody was coming out, not just to vote for me. Of course, by then I had very good name recognition. We had billboards up and TV commercials and radio commercials. And the Sanders endorsement, of course, really it landed me on major networks and major cable news channels. But folks weren't just voting for me. I had strangers getting out of their cars on election day and coming up, shaking my hand and saying, I'm here to vote on one election, and it's to vote against that. You know, they actually have some kind of name for her. So when the polls closed, let me back up and just say the day before the election, so this would have been August 29th, the local NBC6 on their website had a preview of the next day's elections, so that anyone going to their website could see, oh, there's a race for sheriff, there's a race for county commissioners, and all the races were zeroed out. No votes had been counted yet, except for my race. Wasserman Schulz 58, Canova 42, with 69% of the precincts reporting.
Okay.
The day before, what is this about? We called them up and asked, never got an explanation. They took that information down. And anyway, the polls closed on election day. Within an hour, she was declared a victor by about the same percentage that the NBC6 had reported the day before.
Wow.
So it seemed odd to me, especially quite counter to our internal numbers, that I didn't concede. And instead, I made a request to the Broward County Supervisor of Elections at the time, named Brenda Snipes, requested to inspect the paper ballots. And under Florida's public records laws, paper ballots, all the election materials, the scanned images, you name it, that's all election material that the election officials are under legal obligations under federal and state law to maintain and retain for 22 months. And she was not willing to turn over any of this. About 6 months went by where I was trying to work with her lawyers through my lawyers, and we kept getting a runaround. And finally, I told my lawyer to please file a lawsuit. And we sued in June of 2017. And there was a lot of pretrial motions going back and forth. And it was at around August of 2017 that we served formal discovery requests, pretrial discovery requests. And these are interrogatories and requests for production of documents and requests for depositions. And 3 days after we served those requests, on September 1st, 2018, Brenda Snipes signed an order to destroy every ballot that had been cast in my primary.
Wow.
And refused, I should say, failed to disclose that ballot destruction to the court or to me or my lawyers for more than 2 months.
Wow.
And even when they admitted to this, instead of, an apology and trying to settle the lawsuit, they continued to sort of obstruct the lawsuit, and we went on to depositions.
Wow.
And we deposed Brenda Snipes in a videotaped sworn deposition in which she admitted to the ballot destruction, and she had no excuse. She offered no excuse, and we deposed one of her top aides, and he also admitted to the ballot destruction. And we had a copy of the ballot destruction order as well. This is absolutely this evidence could not be rebutted in any way. And the judge on Florida 17th Circuit granted a summary judgment, 10-page order in which he listed the various state and federal statutes that the supervisor had violated. Some of these with criminal penalties, felonies with up to 5 years in prison.
Wow.
Including despoiling evidence, you name it. And at that point, I was trying to run for a second attempt against Wasserman Schulz. I had written to all the Democratic public officials in Broward County. I had written to all the, not just Democrats, all the members of Congress and the U.S. Senate, asking for an investigation. and of course did not get a single response, which was deafening. And that silence, I should say.
Yep.
My lawyer, I asked him, why aren't the Republicans in Tallahassee or in Broward doing anything? After all, this is Democratic Party corruption.
Yeah.
And Rick Scott was the governor, and his Department of Law Enforcement never investigated. And you wouldn't need much of an investigation. All you'd need to do is prosecute. I spoke with the acting U.S. attorney at the time, Ben Greenberg, and he spoke to my lawyer for something like 90 minutes. And again, this is like an open and shut case that a second-year law student could prosecute successfully.
Yeah.
Greenberg seemed to be very excited about prosecuting, or very willing to, I should say.
Okay.
And then he went up to Washington, D.C. for a week of meetings at the Justice Department with, among others, Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, the second most powerful position at the Justice Department. And when Greenberg came back to South Florida, he said he didn't have the resources to prosecute this. It was too complicated a case. So,
wow, that's really tough. And did I'm sorry, her name was Debbie, you said? No, not Debbie. The person who ordered the ballots to be destroyed. What was her name again?
Brenda Snipes.
Brenda Snipes. Did Brenda Snipes ever give a reason, why the ballots were destroyed? Like, did she ever explain that at all, or what was her reason?
The videotape deposition is priceless. She says, well, it was a mistake. My aides put lots of papers in front of me to sign, and I just signed them all.
Interesting. So
she's basically saying it was gross negligence instead of intentional, which doesn't much matter. It's still culpable under the law. And the fact that they withheld this for 2.5 months from us in the court really goes to the willfulness of it as well. And I asked my lawyer, who was a Republican. I had first tried to get a Democrat lawyer as an election lawyer for my campaign. And it became clear running against the head of the DNC, it would be impossible to get a lawyer, an election lawyer I could trust. So I got a Republican who was did a very good job in many ways. And I asked him, why aren't the Broward Republicans and why aren't the Tallahassee Republicans up in arms about this? They've been angry about Brenda Snipes for many years and many elections. And here she's caught red-handed committing felonies. And he didn't have an answer. He said, Tim, let me look into this. And he called me back a couple of weeks later and he said, the Republicans aren't going to lift a finger to help. And it's because they have the same friends as Debbie.
That's I feel like a more of a common theme than people realize. Sometimes I tend to get the feeling that Democrats and Republicans are kind of like a good cop, bad cop situation where they're both kind of working towards the same goal overall, and
working for the same financial backers.
Yeah, working for the same financial backers. And it's funny because when I was in college, I actually interned at an organization called the National Petrochemical and Refiners Association, which was the lobbyist association, for oil companies at the time. So that was a very interesting experience where I got to see, a little bit about, how lobbying works. And so, that was definitely an eye-opening experience I had over there.
And that trade association, I'm sure, contributed money to both Democrats and Republicans.
Yes, definitely. They take a lot of time studying how, Democrats and Republicans vote, on various bills, and that, has an influence on, like where the money goes, because the public reasoning for it is, they want to support people, who align with their interests. So, I get it. But, it's a very funny system, like here in America, and there's corruption all over the world. But I think the difference is a lot of that corruption has been legalized and normalized in America, where it's not even really thought of, as corruption anymore. Because nobody really goes to jail for it. So, and unless, in very rare cases, I should say. But
well, what's funny is in 2018, in the general election, in Florida, we were voting for a new governor and a senator. You had the incumbent Bill Nelson, Democrat, running for the Senate against Rick Scott, who was the governor. And then in the governor's race, you had Ron DeSantis, who had been a congressman, running against Andrew Gillum, who had been a mayor, Gillum being a Democrat. And both those races were too close to call. They both kind of crash landed in Broward County. Yep. And the day after the election, with it too close to call, Brenda Snipes, the supervisor of elections, was still finding thousands of ballots that they didn't know they had that showed up here or there. Now, the supervisor's office also had a ballot on demand machine in which they could print out ballots. So there were a lot of suspicions of wrongdoing going on. And suddenly, you know, I should back up and say for the prior year, once I put my finger on that third rail of election corruption, suddenly MSNBC, CNN, and even Fox News, none of them wanted to speak with me. Now, with the Senate and governor's race crash landing in Broward County, suddenly my phone starts ringing. And I went on Fox News 3 mornings in a row to tell the story of what Brenda Snipes did with my ballots. And, you know, of course, it was relevant because anyone who would destroy every ballot that was cast probably would not have much of a moral compass or ethical constraints in finding fake ballots to throw.
I can imagine.
It was a pivotal moment in a lot of ways. And within a couple of days, I think Jeb Bush, the former governor, who had first appointed Brenda Snipes to fill an opening as election supervisor, he was calling for her to resign. And the writing was on the wall very quickly then, and she got ousted, first fired, I think, by Rick Scott, then she sued to try to be reinstated. When DeSantis came in, he essentially allowed her, instead of fighting, to enforce the firing of her. He allowed her to resign, and she resigns with $130,000 a year pension.
Oh, wow. That's a really big goodbye gift. 130,000 a year for life. That's pretty good. So yeah, it's strange seeing you know, a lot of the irregularities that you know, happen you know, in elections in this country, especially when you compare it to a country like Estonia, which actually didn't even have I believe 50% of the country had phone lines when they gained their independence from the Soviet Union in about the year 1990. And they're actually the first country in the world to have blockchain-based or distributed ledger-based, you know, voting, I should say, which is a lot more transparent and a lot more secure than the elections here in America. So it's really strange just to see how much more advanced other countries are, even in their elections, than, you know, here in America. But
it's interesting because, and I'm open to hearing more about blockchain. I've been reading about blockchain voting. A number of countries have moved in that direction. And I think it's probably a lot more secure than what we have. You know, Kim Zetter, a New York Times reporter, I think in 2017, published a piece in the Times called "The Myth of the Hacker-Proof Election Machine." And the experts I've spoken to all say that 98% of the election machines we have in this country, they're all electronic, and they're all inherently vulnerable to either outside hacking or to insider manipulation of the software. And the software is controlled by these just a few vendors, election systems and software. Dominion has gotten a big name from the presidential election, and they're considered proprietary, trade secrets, not to be inspected by anyone, not law enforcement and not the public. So I was curious about election systems and software. They're the ones who run the machines in Florida. I wanted to see who's on their board of directors, and I looked them up, and they don't have a board of directors. It's a private company owned by a private equity fund based in Omaha, Nebraska, called the McCarthy Group. And all you know is the name of the fellow who runs the private equity fund, and that's it. You don't even know who the investors are, and that's who we are trusting our elections to.
Yep, it's weird. In fact, one of the excerpts I had brought, you know, to speak a little bit more about today actually points out, I know a lot of people probably remember the confusion that happened in the primaries last year with Bernie Sanders over in Iowa, where it sounded like there was like the election results weren't even in, yet Pete Buttigieg came out, and announced his victory. And then it kind of turned out it was probably more likely that Bernie actually won. But the name of the company who built the software for those elections is actually called Shadow Inc. So it's just like such an ironic name.
And Buttigieg had a financial interest in that firm too.
And he had a financial interest in that firm. So it's just so funny, like how a lot of these mistakes that happen always seem to happen in favor of the establishment. And
the insider, as opposed to somebody challenging from the outside. I agree. I came to believe that our elections would be more secure if we, like in Egypt or Afghanistan, the voter had to dip his or her thumb into ink
and put a fingerprint on it.
Yeah, but I will say that many countries have banned the electronic voting machines. Yes. And instead they have hand-counted paper ballots that are counted by hand in public. And this is, I think, what would be the most secure and transparent. Blockchain, I'm not against it, but I will say that having a system of hand-counted paper ballots, if they're counted by hand in public, and there's enough resources, and really it would be a fraction of what it costs to have these electronic voting machines, you should have at each precinct representatives of each party, and you pass the ballot along across the table, and each one basically records it on their own ledger. And this is how they do it in Britain, and they do it in many other countries. The United States is one of only a handful of countries in the world that have not banned the electronic voting machine. And I think they're actually putting pressure on some of those other countries to adopt the electronic voting machines. If we had hand counting paper ballots, it would be sort of like jury duty, where it's your civic duty to step up and be part of this process. And it would make it transparent. And it would, at this point, nobody ever trusts any election results anymore. I certainly don't.
Yeah, it's people are questioning like every single election now, and you can't really blame them, just kind of like looking at the history of what happened. In fact, the second time you ran, I remember reading an article that you had written on Medium, about those election results. And like I had heard about your campaign the first time you ran, but the second time you ran, when you actually broke down how you were capped at exactly 5% like of every category, after going from someone with so much name recognition like the last time around, to all of a sudden being capped at exactly 5%. And I believe you pointed out in the article that it was more likely for someone to be struck by lightning like every day for a year in a row, than for you to be capped out at like 5% across like every category or something like that. Is that correct?
That's pretty accurate. A week or some days before that general election in 2018, I was running as an independent at this point, just because the Democrats didn't seem to care about any of this election rigging.
Yeah.
And when you looked at the demographics of the district, it was about 40% Democrat, about 30% or 35% independent, and about 20-25% Republican, roughly, maybe 45% Democrat. But independents were the second largest party.
Yeah.
And some days beforehand, there was a Republican news outlet that published an article saying that there was a Republican poll out there. I had done no polling. This time I didn't raise 3.8 million. I raised several $100,000. Didn't even want to spend the money on polling. And Wasserman Schulz, who had all the money in the world at that point, it was very strange. Why isn't she publishing polls? Well, because the word was that Wasserman Schulz had a low ceiling. She had negative ratings in the district, that she couldn't get above 35%.
Wow.
And this Republican news outlet reported there was a Republican poll that showed me neck and neck with Wasserman Schulz at 34% each, and the Republican back in the below 20%. And then, and it seemed like a real possibility that it seemed neck and neck. I was less confident than 2 years earlier, but it seemed neck and neck. And had I won, I would have been the only independent in the House of Representatives. Yeah. And then the polls closed, and within an hour, Wasserman Schulz is the victor. And as you mentioned, I had 5% of the vote. not just total, but in every demographic group, among
Wow.
Democrats, Republicans, independents, males, females, blacks, Hispanics, whites, in every precinct, regardless of size.
Yeah.
And a fellow named Dr. David Bader, who is one of the leading computational scientists in the country and the head of, I think, New Jersey Tech's computational science program. He took a look at these numbers, and he was the one who said this. He said, those election results are as unlikely as winning the lottery every day for a year.
That's it. It was winning the lottery, not getting struck by lightning. But yeah, that's pretty insane. And you hear, a lot of Democrats right now talking about, trust science, trust math, like that kind of stuff. Like the fact that that didn't at least raise, one or two questions, it really says a lot. It really says a lot, I'd say. And it's disappointing because, America, in my opinion, is still a great hope, like for the rest of the world, and America can still turn itself around. But election integrity and election security is actually really vital to maintaining confidence in government, because if people don't even feel like their voice can be heard, they're a lot more likely to lash out in unpredictable ways, which is, something we saw a little bit, on January 6th, when, some people were upset about the results, didn't believe, Trump lost. And I personally don't have an opinion either way. I can't say I believe for sure he won. I can't say I believe for sure he lost, just because after seeing situations like what happened to you, it's really hard for me personally to like trust a lot of the results I'm hearing about now. So it's a really strange situation to be in, especially because America is supposed to be, the country spreading democracy around the world.
Jay, I agree with you. And I guess I don't really trust the election results from the 2020 presidential election. It's hard to trust any election outcome right now when I saw how very easy it was for them to rig my elections, or what the circumstantial evidence suggests is rigging. That second election where they capped me, turns out that every electronic tabulation machine in my district, in Broward County, had wireless modems on them. So they were designed to allow somebody from the outside to hack in.
Wow. And if you think about it, one of the most disturbing things about that, especially when you consider like, the power of VPNs to kind of like randomize your location, it's kind of like plausible deniability for, like everyone involved in the process, because it would be nearly impossible to tie down like who hacked in where and who changed what, just because, of the nature of electronics. So,
you would need the National Security Agency and Space Force to be tracking these. And short of that, I think there's no way to really tell who's hacking in and when. I don't know who would have the resources to track that. I certainly did not. But, you mentioned without trust in the election outcomes, people might get angry and protest. And that is one of the costs. The other problem, of course, isn't how the average American or the disgruntled American might react to an election result. It's how those who were elected react. Those who are elected know that they are being elected and reelected by a system that's dominated by very shadowy forces. And are they really accountable to the American people? Are they really looking out for our interests? Or are there other agendas, billionaire agendas, that we don't even really know about?
It's really hard to, if they knew that they're being reelected, would be dependent on them not pleasing the people voting for them, but pleasing the people who have the resources to control like election outcomes, then it's something you see play out in politics, like even something like Medicare for all, which I personally strongly support. It's been polling above, I believe, 60, sometimes 70%, across the whole country. That's Democrats and Republicans for some time now. So the country desperately wants it. Lowering drug prices and allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices is something that over 90% of Americans agree on. Yet for some reason, it never gets passed. And right now, Democrats control the presidency, the House, and the Senate, yet they can't seem to get anything done. And now with the election results we had, come back yesterday, where they lost what was supposed to be, a close election or a Democrat win in Virginia. All of a sudden today, Nancy Pelosi comes out and says she wants to reinsert. I want to say it's she said she wants to reinsert like maternity leave like into the bill, but like right after the results come back, she kind of teases something. So I think there's still a little bit of accountability if they feel like the tides are shifting too much. But considering where the bill started and everything Democrats ran on, it's like throwing back a crumb after promising someone a turkey.
Well,
Because yeah,
and I've learned with these politicians, I don't really judge them anymore by what they say as much as by what they do.
exactly.
There are a lot of Democrats who've been promising Medicare for all, but they get into office and they don't really do much to make it happen.
Yeah.
And these were issues that I was running against Wasserman Schulz on. And I knew I was on the right side of these issues and the people were with me. But she takes a lot of money from big pharma, hospitals, you name it, the kinds of interests that don't want Medicare for all. And, there was an interesting study that came out, I think about 5 years ago by professors at Princeton University and Northwestern University. They said, like, the more important the issue is, the more likely that Congress will be on the opposite side of the American people. And issues where there's a bigger and bigger majority of the people in favor of something, there's more chance that Congress will be on the other side.
That's, such a shame because when people feel like they're pushed into a corner and they have no options, unfortunately, that's when you get, like bad reactions, out of people. So I would just, really hope that people start to, wake up, that election security is not just an issue that, people who support Trump, should be concerned about. It should be an issue that everyone is concerned about, no matter, like your political leanings. Like personally, I lean, to the left on a lot of economic issues, on certain social issues. I'm maybe a little bit more, center right, but I look at every, every candidate for their qualities, and I don't really align to any specific party. So
I think that's very typical of a lot of people, myself included. I of course ran as a progressive, and what does it mean to be a progressive? I used to say it means you're not for progress for some, you're for progress for all.
Yes.
But the reality is, on some issues, I was libertarian. On some, I was liberal. On some, I was conservative, and I still am. I think that we need to conserve what has been best in our Constitution, and I'm afraid we've been losing it in the past year and a half now.
Yes, definitely. And on that specific, topic, as a law professor, I'd really love to hear, like your opinion on some of these vaccine mandates that are coming forward right now. So without touching too much on, say, like health consequences, like of the vaccine or COVID, like what would you say, like the legality is of these vaccine mandates that are being pushed right now? Do you think it's right that employers are now demanding, like in certain states, especially like New York and California, like that employers are demanding that you take this vaccine, which isn't really fully approved because it's actually the Pfizer vaccine that's coming out in 2022, not 2022, 2024. That was the version that was approved, not the one that's being given out now. Do you think, so technically this still is an experimental vaccine. Do you think, it's right that or do you think employers have the right to request that of people, or mandate it for people, I should say?
I don't think anyone has that right. I think legally, morally, ethically, I don't see how anyone can demand or coerce someone to take an experimental injection. I don't think under the law it is correct. Informed consent has been a central feature of our jurisprudence since World War II, if not before.
Mhm.
And I know a lot of those who support vaccine mandates point to a 1905 Supreme Court decision, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, in which
Mhm.
the state legislature, first of all, had passed a law requiring a vaccine, and the penalty if you refused was, I forgot what the dollar figure was, $5 or $10, whatever it is. In today's dollars, it would be less than a $200 fine.
Mhm.
Okay. We're not talking about less than a $200 fine now. We're talking about bankrupting people, them losing their jobs, their health insurance, you name it. And even in Jacobson versus Massachusetts, the Supreme Court said the penalty and the restrictions have to be reasonable. We've
Yeah.
gone way beyond reasonable to be pushing an experimental injection that still has not had long-term studies.
Yeah.
And then when you look at how the FDA granted the emergency use authorization, I believe they violated the laws. The law
Mhm.
states quite clearly that if there's any other effective alternative therapeutic
Mhm.
treatments, that the FDA cannot approve for emergency authorization.
Yeah.
And they really had to whitewash ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and other therapeutics that are effective.
Yes, yes. It's really crazy just watching how the media portrayed ivermectin to be quote unquote horse medication, when almost every kind of medication that's given out regularly to humans does have an animal form, because animals also suffer from a lot of the same things that we go through. So the fact that they were framing it as a horse dewormer is kind of like I remember I saw a meme that said Joe Rogan, the top line was Joe Rogan tells people they should drink water, and the CNN headline was Joe Rogan promotes like substance commonly used as engine coolant. Like people drink engine coolant. So it's like the same thing. But I want to go back to that informed, like consent comment you made just now, because if we don't actually have long-term observations and long-term studies about what this like vaccine can do to people and the effects of like on overall mortality, it doesn't seem possible that people can be given informed consent when the people who are supposed to inform you don't even have all the information yet. So it doesn't even seem like it's possible like for people to give informed consent at this point. So yeah, would
That
you
is,
agree with that? Yeah.
well, I've made a similar point.
Hmm.
I teach First Amendment law, and when you see the degree of censorship that's going on, where
Hmm.
actual information
Hmm.
about that we know of about the
Yeah.
adverse side effects. Well, the best guess we have of the adverse side effects is the VAERS reporting system, the Vaccine Adverse Effects Reporting System,
Yeah.
run by the CDC. And there was a Harvard study some years ago that was critical of the VAERS system. It said
Mhm.
it seriously underreports the actual number of adverse effects by
Yep.
about 100 to 1.
Yep. I
So
remember seeing that.
even under VAERS right now, it's showing something like 15,000 deaths. If it underreports it by 10%, I mean, that's incredible. But
Yep.
that's been censored. And
Yep.
it's been censored on social media, and the mainstream media is not reporting it. And this gets to the point of what kind of media do we really have now?
Yeah. And it's really important to put that in perspective, that number you mentioned just now, because the average amount of deaths reported to the VAERS system before this year was actually anywhere between 150 to 200. So from 2020, we went from, I believe it was like 180 deaths reported to the VAERS system to now the most recent number I saw as of a few days ago is actually above 17,000. So yeah, so we've gone from about 160, 170 to 17,000. So that is an astronomical increase. And sometimes I hear people respond to that saying, "Oh, it's crazy anti-vaxxers who are calling in and reporting, like fake vaccine injuries." But if you actually look at the process of how things get published in the VAERS system, the CDC actually has to go through and take a look like at the case of what's being reported before they actually allow it to get published. So yes, I'm sure one or two bad reports may get in there, but I don't think you can explain an increase by that much, like of just crazy anti-vaxxers filing fake reports. And it's a federal crime for someone to do that. So for someone to take that risk, it just doesn't seem logical, like a lot.
I spoke to a doctor, an MD, who got both Pfizer shots and then a booster. And she was showing me her upper arm, which she got the booster some weeks ago, and it's still absolutely swollen and red. It has been for a while. So she went through the trouble of reporting that on VAERS. She took almost 2 hours to work her way through the VAERS reporting system and get it actually recorded.
Wow.
People aren't just doing this for giggles. Those numbers are real. And when you look at, I think it was the swine flu vaccine, when I think 26 people died after taking that vaccine.
They shut it down.
Shut it down right away. So there's other agendas going on here. And the fact that we can't speak openly about this in the media says volumes about the media. We now have 6 giant corporate conglomerates that, through their subsidiaries and affiliates, this after decades of deregulation, those 6 conglomerates now control 90% of the TV and radio broadcast, cable, and print media.
Including local stations too. In fact, I remember seeing a mashup, like it's a video that's going around about news anchors talking about misinformation. And you can tell that they're all being given the same script. And yeah, but this is people of all shades, all colors, from all over the country, all being given, the same script, because I believe a lot of local news media is owned by Sinclair Corporation or something like that.
Yes, especially the radios. And when we look at our print media, we have two of the dominant local papers in South Florida are the Miami Herald and the Sun Sentinel. Yes. Certainly in Broward and in Miami-Dade. And the Miami Herald is owned by the McClatchy Group, the second largest newspaper chain in the country, I believe.
Wow.
The Sun Sentinel is owned by the Tribune Corporation, which I think is the third largest newspaper chain in the country. Wow. So the concentration of big media is like at no other time. And there's now studies suggesting that it's only 15 billionaires who are the major shareholders in those 6 corporate conglomerates.
Yep.
And then you look at social media, big tech, and it's as much cartelized monopoly market power as anywhere we've ever seen. So this is the legacy of giving up on antitrust enforcement, and that has happened under Democrat and Republican administrations from Clinton to Bush to Obama.
Yep. It's sad. You see the trend continuing, no matter which party is in office, which is why, I think we're at, I want to say it seems like we're in, a little bit of a transitional period right now. There are more people coming out, announcing about different third-party initiatives that are happening. I don't know if you heard, but Andrew Yang is going to be launching a party called, I believe it's the Forward Party. Jimmy Dore has been working with Cornel West and a few other people to promote, I believe it's called the People's Party, that has been picking up too. So you're seeing a little bit more traction pick up with some of these third parties.
And the People's Party had endorsed me, so I'm well familiar with them. When you take a look at the election reform bills in Congress, the main Democratic election reform bill, none of these proposals ban electronic voting machines. The 2 parties are not about to make room for a third party. I have little doubt that Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate in 2016, did better in reality, among the voters than the official results would indicate. So I wish I could say I was optimistic, but in 2016, the largest group in the electorate were those who were registered and did not vote. People are opting out of the system. Now, I think that trend did not continue in 2020. There was so much both anti-Biden and anti-Trump feeling that some of the people who had not voted in the past and wouldn't vote did actually vote. And then, of course, there might have been a lot of people who were in the grave who voted.
Mm, yeah. And yeah, that was, I believe we're in a state where some people think that we're more polarized than we actually are. And in some cases, people are, like very polarized now, but I think people don't realize how much they do actually agree on, just because of even the framing of situations a lot of the time. And, like one word people love to throw around out there, socialism. If you speak to anybody, like who's politically aligned to the right or politically more Republican, and they hear that word socialism, alarm bells like will start going off in their head. But if you ask them about Medicare for all, without calling it, a government-run takeover like of your healthcare, or do you want the government to take away your private insurance? If you frame it, in a way that's more reasonable, those people will actually support what is, for all intents and purposes, a little bit more of a socialist, policy, which is Medicare for all. So I think people are so caught up in labels a lot of the time
Picking
and
either,
buzzwords.
yeah,
Mhm.
and picking a team. My
Yeah,
part,
and
right?
picking it. Exactly.
What I'm beginning to look into as one way to bring about change
Mhm.
are citizen grand juries. There are some
Okay.
states that allow citizens to basically bring grand jury indictments, or to get a grand jury to investigate, I should say.
Okay.
And unfortunately, we've seen, I think, in the past several years that our prosecutors, especially at the federal level, but maybe at a lot of state levels too,
Mhm.
and law enforcement, FBI, you name it, they've become very politicized.
Mm.
Um, I teach a seminar on captured agencies,
Okay.
how private industry is able to capture the bureaucracy and the key legislative subcommittees with jurisdiction over those industries. And they do it through a variety of techniques. Political scientists refer to these as iron triangles. They have
Mhm.
revolving doors where people will work in the private sector and then work for the government
Mm.
agencies and then back to the private sector.
Yep.
They spend a lot of money on lobbying. They spend a tremendous amount on campaign donations.
Mhm.
So those are all techniques to capture government agencies.
Mhm.
And we used to think that the courts and the law enforcement agencies were above that. But
Mm.
I'm no longer convinced of that. And that's a frightening thought, because that means the rule of law has been up for sale itself.
Yeah, that's a really that's a really scary concept, especially when you consider like the fact that America is really considered supposed America is usually considered like a safe haven, and at least you can count on the rule of law to hold people accountable when it comes down to it. So with that being said, I know election security is definitely one of the things you care about most. For everyone out there who's watching, to kind of start wrapping this up, what would you say, someone who cares about election security, what would you say the best way that person can make a difference in America would be? Someone who wants to help address that issue.
It's a tough question. As somebody who's, put himself out there and run for office twice,
Mm.
and tried to do my best to open people's eyes to these issues. Uh,
Mhm.
you saw what the system was able to do to my campaigns.
Mm.
I could say, well, just get out there and vote. Well, I had thought for a while, why vote? It only makes you complicit in a corrupt system. I'm not going to vote anymore. I thought about that.
Mhm.
But there is something to be said for voting, for this reason. There are times where a candidate might be so popular that it makes it so difficult for the establishment to rig against him and her. And
Yeah,
the
that's true.
establishment starts getting sloppy in the rigging,
That's true.
making lots of mistakes, and it becomes more apparent. And
Mhm.
um, I guess the best thing that anyone can do, any of us as
Mhm.
Americans, as human beings, is, whether you're voting or not, is to uh, try not to identify so much with just one party and
Mhm.
demonize anyone who disagrees. And that's what's really been lost in our country in the past couple of decades now.
Hmm.
This idea that we're going to demonize the messenger instead of talk about the message. And maybe part of it is social media where, you Twitter, it's what, 140 characters or something. And these are all hit and run attacks in a way. And the level of discourse and debate has deteriorated. There are media studies that show the length of the average soundbite. And I talk to my students about this. A lot of students don't know what I mean by soundbite. But when you turn on the evening news, and the evening news, let's say, has Joe Biden up there or Donald Trump or any figure, and suddenly it's not the anchor person talking or a reporter talking. You've got a snippet of Biden speaking, uninterrupted. That's the soundbite. In 1968, the length of the average soundbite on the evening news was 43 seconds.
Wow.
I'll tell you, a stump speech is usually 2 minutes. You could say a lot in 43 seconds. You can start laying out your ideas a bit. And it's not intermediated by the media, right? It's a soundbite.
Yes.
By 1992, the length of the soundbite was 7 seconds.
Wow.
Today, I'm not even sure there are sound bites on many of the programs. You might see a video of Biden, but you don't even hear him speaking for more than 2 or 3 seconds sometimes. So the level of our discourse has deteriorated as the media has become more concentrated. And there's not much we can do about that as individuals. But it reminds me of the Soviet Union in its final years. A state media, big. You turn on the TV, you're hearing what the party wants you to hear. Turn it on here, you're hearing what the two parties want you to hear. But what was happening in the Soviet Union in their civil society was at dinner tables, in parks, where people could speak freely to each other. It was a whole different conversation going on. When it hit a tipping point, the people were already there, ready for the change. And I'm afraid that's not the case in this country right now. We have to start speaking to each other and listening to each other and not demonizing each other. That's the most important thing that any of us can be doing right now.
I agree. And, I have friends from, all different sides of the political spectrum. Again, even though I personally, don't support Trump, I don't support Biden either. So it doesn't really bother me like who someone else supports. And I would vote for someone just based off the choices that are available in front of me. So even though I don't really support someone, that doesn't mean I wouldn't cast a vote for them, because the fact is you do have to make a choice, one way or another. But, I'd agree with that. And I think, we need to stop focusing so much on the labels and start talking about the actual policies and establishing common reality. And I think one thing social media and the media have done has it has polarized the information that people receive. So even though they may agree on a lot of the issues, they're living really in different worlds because like they're looking at different sets of data that have been, cherry picked to support, whatever narrative, that media outlet is trying to push. So I definitely, double down on that and just encourage people to, start looking at the actual ideas and looking at examples of how things play out across the world instead of just focusing, on what you think the best form of capitalism is. Like, I'm a capitalist in many situations, not in every situation. So I think the free market is good sometimes. Sometimes it needs a little bit of help from the public sector.
Oh, and the question is, do we have free markets? Thousands of our industries now are more like cartels. Very centralized, concentrated market power. And that's what the antitrust laws were originally designed for, was to break up monopolies. And so during especially the first campaign, I was often asked, including on Fox Business a couple of times, that I was asked about my political philosophy. The question would usually be, well, Bernie Sanders supports you and you're supporting Bernie Sanders. And I did support Sanders over Hillary Clinton. So if you're elected, will you be supporting his socialist agenda? That was, and others just came right out and said, are you a socialist? And, my view was I supported Main Street capitalism. When I say Main Street capitalism, I mean the ability of any of us to start our own small businesses, family-owned businesses. These
Yeah.
have been squeezed out so terribly in the last 50 years.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of capitalism is not a voracious, imperialistic, oppressive capitalism.
Yes. Yes.
That is freedom and hard work and responsibility. And
Exactly.
what I see is when you move too far towards that kind of monopolistic cartel capitalism, well, what's the difference between that and Chinese type of model state capital, state socialism, or whatever you want to call it? They're both centralized, giant power centers that monopolize markets and can exploit and oppress people, whether as consumers or as workers.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I remember reading someone had shown me an article just comparing the size of the Chinese Communist Party, aka how many members are in it, compared to the amount of billionaires, and wealthy corporations that have an outsized influence, in American elections. And it's really not as different, like as a lot of people want to
Very
believe.
centralized and concentrated power.
Very,
Absolutely.
very centralized. So on that note, I definitely, it's been about an hour now. So, I really want to thank you, for your time, for coming, agreeing to this interview. And yeah, I really want to encourage everyone out there to go look him up on, Instagram and social media. In fact, can you share your social media links so people know how to get in touch with you?
Sure. And Jay, I just wanted to thank you for the great discussion. It was wonderful to meet you at the Jimmy Dore show, and very glad I came on your program. I honestly don't remember all my addresses. I know I have the blue check mark or something on Twitter and Facebook, so I'm a verified person on those. I'm also on Telegram now. I just joined very recently. So those who are moving towards Telegram, I think it's Tim_Canova, I think, and Instagram as well. So I'm sorry to say that I don't know off the top of my head my own social media addresses, but it won't take folks long to find me on any of those. And I've been on Instagram a bit lately, and just beginning to explore Telegram. My campaign really was fueled by Facebook in many ways, but to see the kind of censorship and shadow banning that I suffered personally there, but that others are as well now on an even larger scale, it's very troubling. I think these social media companies, these big companies, should be really treated as common carriers and public utilities.
Yeah, I agree with that, and especially when you consider the fact that technology is supposed to allow people to, get their voice out there and democratize media a bit more. You're kind of seeing a reversion back to the old ways where, only approved messages are allowed to get to you. And even my social media pages on Instagram and like both of my personal and the one for this show, now if you try and follow it, it says that my page spreads misinformation. Are you sure you want to follow me? Which is funny because like nothing on my page is misinformation. It's all verifiable facts that you can go look up for yourself. But if it doesn't agree with the mainstream narrative, it's automatically gets labeled misinformation. So.
Well, Jay, I would wear that as a badge of honor.
Yep. Hopefully, I wish I could say, I was proud as Jimmy Dore, like is of it. I know he's been experiencing it too, but I don't have the following Jimmy Dore has yet. So
you will in time.
Hopefully. So but yeah, I'll go ahead, I'll actually link to your Instagram and your Twitter in the comments section of this video. So anyone who's interested, definitely check them out, and make sure you're subscribed to this channel if you haven't already. Like the video, share it, and comment on it. Let me know what you guys.
Last word, Jay. One last word. You asked what folks can do. The obvious is to take care of your health, to be mindful. Think mindfully, to eat mindfully, and to take care of ourselves, because I'm not so sure the government or big pharma or anyone else is looking out for our health.
Agreed. I'm a vegetarian, hopefully transitioning to vegan, taking that last step sometime soon. I know you're a vegan too, so but yeah, it's good to be part of the club. So
absolutely. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for your time. Have a good one, Tim.
Take care.
All right. You too. Bye.